You're 24 years old, standing at the edge of a track, and you're watching someone else run your dream. You've trained for years. You've pushed through pain, sacrificed weekends, structured your entire life around becoming elite. And now, in this moment, watching another runner cross the finish line 3 seconds faster than you could ever manage, you feel something shift inside you. Not anger. Not even disappointment. Just a cold, clarifying truth: you're not going to make it. You're good. Maybe even very good. But you're not great. You'll never be great. Not at this. And the question that follows that realization is devastating. If I'm not a runner, then who am I? This is where most people's stories end. They walk away from the dream, tell themselves to be realistic, find something stable and safe. They convince themselves that passion was a phase, that it's time to grow up. But for a small number of people, this moment of failure becomes something else entirely. Not an ending. A redirection. In 1962, a young man named Phil Knight stood in exactly this position. He was a middle-distance runner at the University of Oregon, training under the legendary coach Bill Bowerman. Phil was dedicated, obsessive even. He studied running mechanics, nutrition, training schedules. He lived and breathed track and field. But there was one problem he couldn't solve: he wasn't fast enough. Not for the Olympics. Not for national recognition. Not even for regional dominance. He was perpetually good, surrounded by people who were great. And he knew it. Most people remember Phil Knight as the billionaire founder of Nike, the man who built a $150 billion empire. What they don't know is that he started as a failed athlete who couldn't let go of the sport that rejected him. This is his story. But more importantly, it's a blueprint for what happens when you refuse to abandon your obsession, even after your first expression of it dies. Because here's what Phil Knight discovered, and what changed everything: your passion doesn't have to die when your dream does. It just needs a different vehicle. We live in a culture that's obsessed with the idea of following your passion and never giving up. We're told that if we want something badly enough, if we work hard enough, we'll achieve it. But that's not always true, is it? Sometimes you give everything you have, and it's still not enough. Sometimes talent has a ceiling. Sometimes dedication can't overcome genetics, or timing, or the simple mathematics of competition where only a tiny fraction can reach the top. And when that happens, when you're forced to confront the gap between loving something and being elite at it, most people make one of two choices. They either keep chasing the impossible, wasting years in denial, or they abandon the passion entirely, concluding that if they can't be the thing, they should move on to something completely different. Phil Knight made a third choice. And that choice is why you're wearing Nikes right now, or why the greatest athletes in the world, from Cristiano Ronaldo to Serena Williams, compete in shoes that carry his swoosh. This isn't a story about pivoting. It's not about resilience in the typical sense. It's about something more specific and more powerful: the transformation of obsession. It's about learning to ask a different question when your dream fails. Not "what else should I do," but "how else can I serve this thing I love?" Let me take you back to where it started. The University of Oregon in the late 1950s was a breeding ground for serious distance runners. Bill Bowerman, the head coach, was a legend, a man who would eventually coach 33 Olympians and write the book that popularized jogging in America. Training under Bowerman was an education in obsession. He didn't just teach running technique, he taught a philosophy of continuous improvement, of questioning every assumption about what made athletes faster. Phil Knight absorbed all of it. He studied his competitors. He analyzed his splits. He experimented with different training regimens. He had the mindset of a champion, But when the stopwatch clicked and the results were posted, he had the times of someone who was just good. Not bad. Good. The kind of good that makes you a respected member of the team but never gets you to the Olympics. The kind of good that means you're constantly watching someone else stand on the podium. There's a specific pain in that experience that most people never talk about. It's not the pain of being terrible at something, which is easier to dismiss. It's the pain of being close enough to greatness to understand exactly what you're missing, and knowing you can't close that gap. Phil could see the level he needed to reach. He could measure the distance in tenths of a second. And he knew, with brutal clarity, that he would never get there. So what do you do with that? Most athletes in Phil's position eventually drift away from the sport. They find other careers, other identities. They tell themselves it was fun while it lasted. And there's no shame in that, it's the rational choice. But Phil couldn't do it. Even after his competitive running career ended, even after he graduated and took a job as an accountant, he couldn't stop thinking about running. He couldn't stop reading about training methods, couldn't stop following track and field results, couldn't stop analyzing what separated good runners from great ones. And somewhere in that obsessive analysis, he noticed something that would change his life. Most American runners were training in terrible shoes. This was the early 1960s, and the athletic shoe market was primitive. Runners mostly trained in Adidas or Puma, expensive German imports, or cheap American sneakers that provided almost no support. Phil had experienced this firsthand. He'd dealt with blisters, shin splints, injuries that came from inadequate footwear. And he started asking himself a question that had nothing to do with his own athletic performance. What if American runners could access high-quality, affordable running shoes? It was a simple question. But it came from a place of genuine knowledge. Phil wasn't some outside entrepreneur who saw a market opportunity. He was an insider who had lived the problem. He understood exactly what runners needed because he'd needed it himself. And that's when the obsession began to transform. During a trip to Japan in 1962, Phil had what he would later call his crazy idea. He visited the Onitsuka Tiger Company, a manufacturer of high-quality athletic shoes that weren't available in the United States. The shoes were well-made, technically sophisticated, and significantly cheaper than German imports. Phil saw immediately what they could mean for American runners. So he did something audacious. He walked into the Onitsuka office and introduced himself as the representative of Blue Ribbon Sports, a completely fictional American distribution company that existed only in his imagination. He pitched them on the idea of importing their shoes to the United States. And somehow, incredibly, they agreed. A few months later, the first shipment arrived, 12 pairs of running shoes, sitting in boxes in his parents' house. Phil Knight, former accountant, former failed athlete, was now in the shoe business. He had no storefront, no employees, no business infrastructure. What he had was a car with a trunk and an obsession with running. So he did the only thing that made sense: he started driving to track meets. Picture this. It's 1964. You're a college runner, finishing a Saturday morning practice, and this guy pulls up in a beat-up car. He's not a sales rep with a polished pitch. He's clearly a fellow runner, someone who understands exactly what you're dealing with. He opens his trunk, shows you these Japanese shoes you've never heard of, and starts talking about pronation and arch support and weight distribution with the specificity of someone who spent years thinking about these exact problems. You try them on. They feel better than anything you've run in. And they cost half what you'd pay for Adidas. You buy a pair. That was Phil's business model in the beginning. Trunk sales at track meets. In his first year, he sold $8,000 worth of shoes. To put that in perspective, that's barely enough to cover basic living expenses. This wasn't a business, it was a side hustle. But Phil saw something that revenue numbers couldn't capture. Runners trusted him. They trusted him because he wasn't selling to them. He was serving them. He'd been in their position. He knew their struggles intimately. When he talked about shoes, he wasn't reading from a marketing script, he was sharing knowledge earned through years of personal experience. And this is the first crucial principle that separates Phil's story from typical entrepreneurship advice. Your failed attempt at the thing makes you credible when you serve the people still doing the thing. Think about that for a second. The fact that Phil wasn't a professional runner, the fact that he'd hit his ceiling and couldn't go further, didn't disqualify him from the running world. It qualified him to serve runners in a different capacity. He had insider knowledge. He understood the technical details. He'd lived the pain points. That failure, that limitation, became his greatest asset when he changed his role from competitor to supplier. This pattern shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. Failed musicians become legendary music producers because they understand the creative process from the inside. Former athletes who never went pro become elite coaches because they've experienced the struggle without the ego of superstardom. Entrepreneurs whose first businesses failed build better second businesses because they've made the expensive mistakes already. The question isn't whether you failed at your first dream. The question is, what did that failure teach you that no one else knows? For Phil, it taught him exactly what runners needed, from someone who genuinely understood their experience. And that knowledge, not natural sales talent or business pedigree, became the foundation of everything that followed. By 1965, Phil's side business was growing, but he had a problem: he couldn't scale alone. He was still working full-time as an accountant, selling shoes on weekends, and the administrative work was overwhelming. He needed a partner. Not a business partner in the traditional sense. He needed someone who understood the product as deeply as he understood the market. So he went back to the one person who had shaped his understanding of running more than anyone else, Bill Bowerman, his former coach at Oregon. Bowerman was a natural fit, but not for the reasons you might think. He wasn't interested in business. He was interested in obsession. Specifically, he was obsessed with making better running shoes. While Phil was selling shoes, Bowerman was in his garage, literally tearing them apart and rebuilding them. He would destroy perfectly good pairs of sneakers to test different materials, different sole patterns, different lacing configurations. His wife would come home to find the kitchen table covered in rubber, glue, and shoe parts. Bowerman's philosophy was simple: every element of a running shoe could be improved, and those improvements mattered. A few ounces of weight could mean seconds off a mile time. Better cushioning could prevent injuries that ended careers. This wasn't theoretical for him. He'd coached hundreds of runners and watched how equipment affected their performance. When Phil approached him about partnering in Blue Ribbon Sports, Bowerman agreed immediately. He put up $500, matching Phil's investment, and they split the company 50-50. But more valuable than the money was what Bowerman brought to the partnership: product obsession that matched Phil's market obsession. This is a pattern worth noting. Phil didn't just find a partner with complementary skills. He found someone whose obsession was compatible with his own. Phil understood runners and distribution. Bowerman understood biomechanics and manufacturing. Together, they could build something neither could create alone. Their early experiments were mostly failures. Bowerman designed shoes that fell apart after a few miles. Phil placed orders they couldn't afford and nearly bankrupted the company multiple times. But they kept iterating. Every failure taught them something. Every complaint from a runner became data for the next design. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because for the next 10 years, from 1964 to 1974, Blue Ribbon Sports was in a constant state of near collapse. They were always 30 to 60 days away from bankruptcy. Always scrambling to pay suppliers. Always one missed shipment away from losing everything. Phil would go to banks asking for loans to cover inventory, and bankers would look at him like he was insane. Athletic shoes? That's not a real business. That's a fad. Come back when you're selling something serious. But Phil had no choice except to keep moving. He couldn't get traditional financing, so he got creative. He would delay payments to suppliers as long as possible. He would personally guarantee loans he couldn't afford to lose. He would work 18-hour days at his accounting job to keep money flowing while building Blue Ribbon on nights and weekends. Most people think of successful entrepreneurs as risk takers, but that's not quite right. Phil wasn't seeking risk. He was trapped in it. He couldn't afford to scale safely, so he scaled dangerously. Every growth decision put the entire company at risk. But staying small meant dying slowly, so he chose the risk that gave him a chance. And this brings us to the second crucial principle. Most empire builders spent years in financial terror, but they kept moving anyway. We have this idea that successful people feel confident when they make big decisions. That they have some internal certainty the rest of us lack. But Phil's memoir, Shoe Dog, makes it clear that's not true. He was terrified constantly. He would lie awake at night doing mental math on whether they could make payroll. He would have panic attacks about shipments stuck in customs. He was perpetually afraid. But here's what separated him from people who stayed stuck. He learned to make decisions while afraid. He didn't wait for the fear to go away. He didn't wait until he felt ready. He just asked himself, what's the next necessary move? And then he made it. This is the decision that separates builders from dreamers. Dreamers wait for certainty, for permission, for the feeling of readiness. Builders move while terrified, understanding that fear is not a stop sign. It's just the cost of doing something that matters. If you've ever felt like you're building something on the edge of collapse, like one wrong move could destroy everything you've worked for, you're not alone. You're in the exact position Phil Knight occupied for a decade. The question isn't how to eliminate that feeling. The question is, can you keep moving anyway? By 1971, Blue Ribbon Sports had built something real. They were selling hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Onitsuka Tiger shoes annually. They had employees, a small office, a growing reputation among serious runners. Phil had proven that his crazy idea wasn't crazy at all. The market for high-quality running shoes in America was massive, and he'd positioned himself perfectly to serve it. And that's when everything nearly fell apart. Phil discovered that Onitsuka, his Japanese supplier and partner, was planning to cut him out. They were in secret negotiations with other American distributors, looking to replace Blue Ribbon Sports entirely. After 7 years of building their brand in the United States, after creating the distribution network and customer relationships that made Onitsuka viable in America, Phil was about to lose everything. This is a specific kind of betrayal that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. It's not just business. When you've dedicated years of your life to building something, when you've risked everything on a partnership, when you've operated in good faith while someone else was planning to replace you, it doesn't just hurt financially. It's personal. Phil had two choices. He could fight Onitsuka in court, try to preserve the relationship, and hope for the best. Or he could do something that seemed impossible, create his own shoe brand from scratch and compete directly with the company that had been his entire business. Most consultants would have told him to take the safe route. Litigation. Negotiation. Compromise. But Phil had learned something crucial over those 7 years of near bankruptcy: safety is an illusion. Playing it safe could kill you just as easily as taking risks. So he made the decision that would define everything that followed. Blue Ribbon Sports would become a shoe manufacturer, not just a distributor. They would design their own shoes, find their own factories, build their own brand. They needed a name. Phil's team suggested several options, but nothing felt right. Finally, one of his employees, Jeff Johnson, suggested Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Phil didn't love it, but they were out of time. They needed to trademark something immediately. So Nike it was. They needed a logo. Phil hired a graphic design student from Portland State University named Carolyn Davidson. He paid her $35 to create what would become one of the most recognizable symbols in the world, the swoosh. Think about that for a second. $35. The logo that would eventually appear on billions of dollars worth of products, that would become synonymous with athletic excellence, was created by a student for the cost of a nice dinner. But the logo didn't matter yet. What mattered was whether they could actually manufacture a shoe that runners would buy. And that's where Bill Bowerman's obsessive experimentation became crucial. Bowerman had been destroying shoes in his garage for years, testing theories about traction and cushioning. One morning, while making waffles, he had an idea that seemed absurd. What if he used his wife's waffle iron to create a new sole pattern? He destroyed the waffle iron, poured rubber into it, created a sole with a waffle pattern that provided better traction than anything else on the market. It was weird looking, unconventional, but it worked. The waffle sole became Nike's first major innovation. Not because Bowerman had some brilliant flash of insight, but because he'd been iterating for years, trying everything, learning from every failure. The waffle iron moment gets remembered, but it was built on hundreds of less memorable moments of experimentation that didn't work. And this is the third crucial principle: your biggest breakthroughs often come when your back is against the wall. Bowerman didn't invent the waffle sole because he had unlimited resources and time to innovate. He invented it because Nike was about to launch and they needed something distinctive, something that would make runners choose their unknown brand over established competitors. Constraint forced creativity that comfort never could. This pattern shows up constantly in breakthrough innovation. The greatest solutions emerge not from abundance but from desperate necessity. When you have unlimited options, you optimize. When you're trapped with your back against the wall, you innovate. Think about your own life. When did you come up with your best ideas? Probably not when everything was comfortable and safe. Probably when you had no choice but to figure something out. When the old way stopped working and you had to create a new way. That's the position Nike was in during the early 70s. They couldn't compete with Adidas and Puma on prestige or marketing budget. They couldn't rely on celebrity endorsements or Olympic visibility. They had to compete on product innovation and authentic connection with runners. So while the German brands were spending millions on advertising, Nike was sending employees to track meets with prototype shoes, asking runners what worked and what didn't, iterating based on real feedback. While Adidas was signing contracts with famous athletes, Nike was building relationships with college runners and high school coaches, the people who actually cared about performance over prestige. It was a ground war. Unsexy, unglamorous, but effective. The period from 1972 to 1980 was brutal. Nike was growing, but so were the problems. They were constantly being sued by Onitsuka. They were fighting trademark battles. They were dealing with quality control issues from factories they barely controlled. Revenue was increasing, but so was debt. Phil was still working insane hours, still facing the possibility of bankruptcy, still making decisions that could destroy everything. And somewhere in those years, something shifted inside him. He stopped trying to avoid risk and started trying to maximize learning. Every problem became a question: what can this teach us? When a shoe design failed, they didn't see it as wasted investment. They saw it as market research. What didn't work? Why? What does that tell us about what runners actually need? When a factory shipped defective products, they didn't just demand refunds. They studied the defects to understand what went wrong in manufacturing and how to prevent it. When a competitor launched a better product, they didn't panic. They bought the competitor's shoes, took them apart, studied them, and figured out how to improve on the design. This mindset, this relentless focus on learning rather than winning, compounded over years into an organizational capability that competitors couldn't match. Nike wasn't just selling shoes. They were building a system for continuous improvement that made them faster and more innovative with each iteration. And Phil himself was transforming. He wasn't the anxious accountant selling shoes from his trunk anymore. He was becoming the person who could run a global company. Not because he took a class or read a book, but because he'd made 10,000 difficult decisions under pressure and learned from each one. Here's the reframe that changed everything for Phil, and it's the reframe that might change everything for you. You're not just building a business. You're becoming the person who can run that business. Every obstacle you face, every problem you solve, every failure you survive is building capabilities inside you that didn't exist before. The struggling period isn't a detour on the way to success. It's the mechanism of transformation. It's how you become someone capable of handling what success requires. Phil spent 10 years on the brink of bankruptcy, terrified and exhausted, making desperate decisions. And those 10 years built the judgment, resilience, and strategic thinking that let him run a multi-billion-dollar empire. If he'd started with funding and safety and certainty, he never would have developed those capabilities. The struggle wasn't the price he paid for success. The struggle was the factory that manufactured the version of him that could succeed. So when you're in the middle of your own struggle, when you're exhausted and afraid and wondering if it's worth it, remember, you're not just trying to survive this. You're being built by it. In 1984, Nike was a successful company, but it wasn't dominant. Reebok was gaining market share. Adidas still had prestige. Nike needed something that would separate them from every competitor, something that would make them not just a shoe company but a cultural force. They found it in a skinny kid from North Carolina named Michael Jordan. Jordan had just been drafted by the Chicago Bulls, 3rd overall. He was talented, clearly, but unproven. Plenty of college stars fail in the NBA. And Nike was considering an offer that seemed completely insane, $2.5 million over 5 years, plus royalties, for a player who hadn't scored a single professional point. To put that in context, that was more than most veteran NBA superstars were making in endorsements. It was an unprecedented bet on an unproven athlete. Phil's own executives thought he'd lost his mind. But Phil saw something in Jordan that went beyond talent. He saw obsession. He saw someone who approached basketball the way Phil approached business, with relentless, almost irrational commitment to improvement. Jordan wasn't just gifted. He was addicted to getting better. And Phil understood that mindset because he'd lived it. He recognized it. So he made the bet. The Air Jordan line launched in 1985, and within a year it had generated over $100 million in revenue. The shoes became cultural phenomena, not just athletic equipment. People who didn't play basketball bought Jordans. The line transcended sports and became fashion, identity, aspiration. And suddenly Nike wasn't just competing with Adidas and Reebok. They were in a different category entirely. They were a cultural brand, a symbol of excellence and achievement that went far beyond running shoes. By the 1990s, Nike was unstoppable. They dominated basketball with Jordan. They dominated running with innovations like Air Max technology. They expanded into soccer, tennis, golf. The Just Do It campaign, launched in 1988, captured in 3 words the philosophy Phil had been living for 30 years: stop overthinking and take action. Revenue hit $1 billion. Then $10 billion. Then $50 billion. By 2020, Nike's market value exceeded $150 billion. The failed athlete who sold shoes from his trunk had built the most valuable athletic brand in human history. But here's what makes Phil's story different from typical rags to riches narratives: the success didn't change who he was. Even after becoming a billionaire, he remained focused on the work, not the wealth. In his memoir, he admits that he never worked a single day for money. He worked for the game. For the challenge. For the obsession with building something that mattered. The money was a side effect. The real reward was getting to spend his life deeply engaged with the thing he loved, even though his first expression of that love, competitive running, had failed. So what made Phil Knight different? Why did his story end in empire while most failed athletes fade into comfortable obscurity? It comes down to 4 pillars, 4 decisions he made that you can make too. Pillar 1, he stayed in his obsession. When Phil's running career ended, he didn't abandon the sport. He didn't conclude that if he couldn't be elite, he should move on to something else. He stayed close to the thing he loved and found a different way to contribute to it. He went from competitor to supplier, from athlete to entrepreneur, but he never left the ecosystem he cared about. Most people make the opposite choice. When their first dream fails, they interpret that as a sign to find a completely different passion. But your deepest knowledge, your most valuable insights, your genuine credibility all come from the thing you've spent years immersed in. Walking away from that is walking away from your greatest asset. Pillar 2, he built from knowledge, not ego. Phil didn't start Nike because he thought he was smarter than everyone else or because he wanted to prove something. He started it because he'd personally experienced a problem, understood it deeply, and saw a solution. His entire business was built on insider knowledge earned through years of being a runner. When you build from that kind of knowledge, you don't have to guess what your market needs. You already know because you've been them. You can speak their language, understand their pain points, anticipate their objections. That's an advantage no amount of market research can replicate. Pillar 3, he moved while terrified. For more than a decade, Phil operated on the edge of bankruptcy. He was constantly afraid. Constantly uncertain. But he didn't let fear stop him from making the next necessary decision. He learned to function while terrified, to act despite uncertainty. This is the capability that separates people who build significant things from people who stay stuck. Not fearlessness. The ability to move while afraid. Phil never stopped being scared. He just stopped letting fear be the deciding factor. Pillar 4, he treated failure as tuition. Every setback, every mistake, every disaster became a learning opportunity. Failed shoe designs taught him what runners didn't want. Financial crises taught him creative problem solving. Betrayals taught him who to trust and how to structure partnerships. Nothing was wasted. Every painful experience became tuition in the education that prepared him to run a global empire. Most people treat failure as evidence that they should quit. Phil treated failure as expensive education that made the next attempt smarter. And over years, those lessons compounded into wisdom that competitors couldn't match. These 4 pillars, staying in your obsession, building from knowledge, moving while terrified, treating failure as tuition. They're not complicated. But they're also not easy. They require a fundamental shift in how you think about failure and success. Let me give you a practical framework, something you can use immediately to apply Phil's principles to whatever situation you're in right now. Step 1. Name what you learned from the dream that failed. Take the thing you walked away from, the ambition that didn't work out, and ask, what did that experience teach me that most people don't know? Maybe you wanted to be a professional musician but didn't make it. What did you learn about the music industry, about creative process, about what separates good from great? Write it down. That's not wasted time. That's proprietary knowledge. Step 2. Identify who else is struggling with what you struggled with. Your past self had problems. Other people have those same problems right now. Who are they? Where do they gather? What are they trying to achieve? This is your market, not because you want to sell them something, but because you genuinely understand their situation. Step 3. Build the solution you wish existed when you were struggling. Don't try to figure out what the market wants through surveys or research. Build what you needed when you were in their position. Phil didn't study market trends. He built the shoes he wished he'd had when he was running. That authenticity is what made people trust him. Step 4. Move before you're ready. Start selling from your trunk. You don't need a perfect product, a registered business, or a polished brand. You need something that solves the problem, and you need to get it in front of people who have that problem. Phil started with 12 pairs of shoes in his trunk. What's your version of that? What's the minimum viable way to start serving the people you understand? Step 5. When betrayal and obstacles come, innovate instead of retreat. You will face setbacks. Suppliers will flake. Partners will disappoint you. Markets will shift. When that happens, don't retreat to safety. Use the constraint to force innovation. Phil lost his supplier and created Nike. What looks like disaster might be the push you need to build something better. Step 6. Let each failure teach you. Compound the lessons over years. This is a long game. Phil spent 30 years building Nike into dominance. 30 years of small improvements, lessons learned, capabilities developed. Don't expect transformation in months. Expect it in years. But know that if you're learning from each setback, you're compounding wisdom that will eventually become unbeatable. Let me bring you back to where we started. The 24-year-old standing at the track, watching someone else run their dream. That person feels like they're at the end of something. They're not. They're at the beginning. The death of one dream is not the death of your potential. It's the birth of permission to build something bigger. Because here's what Phil Knight discovered: being the best runner would have given him medals and records. Building Nike gave him the ability to serve millions of runners, to transform an entire sport, to create something that will outlast him by generations. If he'd made the Olympics, he'd be a footnote in track and field history. Because he didn't, he became immortal. Think about that. The runners who beat Phil on the track, the ones who were faster and more talented, almost all of them are forgotten now. Their names don't mean anything to anyone except track historians. But Phil Knight, the guy who wasn't good enough, is a household name. His company has shaped global culture. His shoes are on the feet of the greatest athletes who ever lived. Your failure didn't disqualify you. It credentialed you. It gave you knowledge that people who succeeded easily will never have. It taught you resilience that comfort could never build. It forced you to innovate in ways that safety would never require. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Phil Knight could have walked away from running and become a comfortable accountant. He would have been fine. Stable. Safe. But he would have spent his life wondering what could have been. Instead, he found a way to stay in the game he loved, just in a different position. And that decision changed everything. So here's my question for you: what dream failed you? What did it teach you that no one else knows? And who else is struggling with what you struggled with? Because if you can answer those 3 questions, you're not at the end of anything. You're at the exact place Phil Knight was in 1962, holding the seeds of something that could be extraordinary. Your dream didn't die. It just outgrew the first version of you. And now you get to build the arena instead of just playing in it. Now you get to serve the thing you love in a way that might matter even more than the original dream. The failed athlete built a $150 billion empire because he refused to let go of his obsession. He just found a different vehicle for it. What's your vehicle? What's the thing you're uniquely positioned to build because of what you failed at? I'll leave you with this: Nike's slogan is "Just do it." 3 words that captured Phil's entire philosophy. But the full story behind those words is richer than you might think. Phil didn't just do it when he felt confident. He just did it when he was terrified. When he was broke. When experts told him he was crazy. When his suppliers betrayed him. When every rational calculation said to quit. He just did it anyway. For 30 years. And it changed the world. What would happen if you did the same? If this story shifted something in you, if you're seeing your own failed dreams differently now, stay with us. We're building a library of these transformations, these stories of people who turned their deepest failures into their greatest contributions. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Because your story isn't over. It's just getting started.